So you've heard the phrase dog reactivity get tossed around all the time, and you're really unsure of what reactivity even is. Or maybe you've heard it and you think you have an idea, but you really don't know if your dog has reactivity or is aggressive. Well, in this video, we're gonna be breaking down the difference between reactivity and aggression and how you train them differently. Coming up. What's up, guys? It's Jenna with Dog Liaison, where I coach you on how to enhance your dog's mental health. On this channel, we like to get a little nerdy and we examine the science motivating dog behavior. And in my signature program, the Recovering Rover program for dog anxiety, I work with dogs facing high anxiety disorders that lead to reactivity and lead to aggression. And often one of the conversations that I have with my clients and with people in the DMs is, how do I know whether or not my dog is reactive or is aggressive? Well, the truth of the matter is that they have more in common than you think. First, let's talk about what reactivity actually is. So there's two lenses to look at this. There's the denotation and there's the connotation, okay? The denotation, or the most science-backed interpretation of what reactivity is, would mean that your dog is reacting to a stimulus. In the same way that your brain is reacting to this video right now, your dog would react to an event or a stimulus or anything in the universe, and that would make him a reactive dog. And so you might be thinking, well, if that's anything, then every dog is a reactive dog. You're right. You would be correct. In a denotative interpretation, any dog who is alive is a reactive dog because they will react to a stimulus in the environment. However, we also have this connotation. And the truth of the matter is that if you have a conversation with a trainer, regardless of what methods they use, they're going to have a little bit of a connotation or a more of a niche association with the word. And so for that, I'm going to give you my personal interpretation of what a reactive dog is. For me personally, a reactive dog is a dog that responds to a stimulus disproportionately to than what it actually calls for. Which is to say, even if the dog is really, really happy in response to a stimulus excessively happily, they are still a reactive dog. Or if a dog, sees a bird and becomes hyper aroused by it, they are experiencing dog reactivity. So any emotion that is, far past what the context calls for, if you're getting exuberant responses, that would be dog reactivity. Now, to be clear, that doesn't necessarily mean that your dog is lunging and barking and pulling. It could be that, he sees an event and that immediately makes him go run underneath the couch and hide. That's still reactivity because something is occurring and he's behaving disproportionately to what that context calls for. Now let's talk about what aggression is. And yes, you can also still think of this as the denotation and the connotation, but the truth of the matter is that even in the science-backed community, there is some arguments and some disagreements on what would be determined aggressive. So some people would say that aggression has more to do with the function of the behavior than it does with the actual behavior, which is to say that it has to do with what is the intent. If the intent is to do harm, then some people would say that is aggression. If the intent was not to do harm, then that is not aggression. In some people's minds. In other people's minds, they would say it doesn't really matter what the intent is because we can't really say what intention is in a dog. What really matters is the result. What is the outcome of the behavior? So the severity of the behavior. If the dog growls, if the dog bites, if the dog lunges, what is the severity of it? That will determine whether or not it's aggression. And so the truth of the matter is that there really isn't a clear consensus, not even just within the different fields of dog trainings and methods, but within even the science-backed community and the researchers, there's not a real good clear consensus on what can be determined aggression and what isn't. I think the overall theme, the recurring theme that I see in the literature has more to do with the behavior. So for example, the dog growls, the dog bites, the dog lunges. What the behavior outcome is what will determine what exactly is aggression. But I want to be very clear that even that is subjective. However, what all the scientific literature can agree on, and what is pretty much conceived as fact, is that aggression is normal. It is a normal response for a species. nearly every species can display aggression, and that aggression is rooted in a very physiological and ancestral part of the body. In fact, in last week's video, I talked about how your dog's aggression is actually rooted in fear. And so if you haven't seen that video, make sure you check that out next to really understand the physiological components of aggression and aggressive displays, because this is going to help you understand why your dog is behaving the way he is and what is the ethical and professional approach to resolving your dog's aggression. But what I want to make very clear is that your dog's aggression is perfectly normal. Just because we don't want it, and just because I'm not saying let's all have aggressive dogs running around, just because that's true doesn't mean that it's abnormal. Aggression is a universal experience, and it is necessary in order for species to survive and thrive. And so it's very important that you understand from a science-backed perspective, reactivity and aggression are perfectly normal behaviors for all dogs and for all species for that matter. Okay, so how do you train reactivity and aggression differently? Well, from the science-backed perspective, you don't. They're effectively the same. They're both being caused by effectively the same parts of the brain, and even if their emotional experience is slightly different, that's subjective. That depends on who you're talking to. What is objective about it is the adrenaline and is the fight, flight, or freeze response, which means we need to train that. And so from a science-backed perspective, there really isn't any difference to how you train them. However, from a connotation perspective, from like an actual worldview, trainer to trainer here, what I would say is that the level of security and the level of safety measures that I take in place with a dog who has a bite history or who at least has tried to bite is going to be different than a dog who just gets really excited when he sees his neighbor and doesn't know how to cope with that arousal. I'm going to take more precautions with the dog who has demonstrated aggression than the dog who hasn't really intended to do harm and has not done any harm yet. It doesn't mean that any dog can't do harm. I want to make it very clear that just because your dog is a reactive dog and not an aggressive dog doesn't mean that your dog can't display aggression. All dogs can display aggression, as we just said. But from a safety measures perspective, I'm going to take more precaution with the dog who has displayed aggression. And from a training perspective, if a dog is experiencing negative associations with their stimulus, which is to say that they perceive that the trigger is a very significant threat, they are angry at it, they are very fearful of it, they are concerned about this stimulus. If that is true, then likely we're going to have a slower learning process only because we have to really change their perception of it. If your dog is excessively reactive in a happy way, which is to say he likes his neighbor and every single time he sees his neighbor he starts lunging and pulling, but he's like, oh my gosh, I'm so happy you're here. We don't really have to convince the dog that this is a good thing. We have less convincing going on. We more just have to teach the dog that when this event happens, we don't need to become so stimulated, right? We can keep our heart rate lower, and this is the behavior we display in this context. Whereas if a dog is experiencing fear or is experiencing concern or anger or frustration, we really have to work on changing that association piece, and that's going to take a little bit longer, especially if the dog has a long history of having a negative association with that thing. The last point I want to bring up here is typing. See, it's very common, and I've done it even in this video, it's very common to type a dog as a reactive dog or as an aggressive dog. And I think that there is a benefit to that in communication, in that we are able to easily get our point across, right? If I say I'm talking about a reactive dog, that immediately puts an image in your head and you know what I'm saying. I have less explanation around it, right? However, you're still labeling a dog, and those labels can be harmful, right? It changes how we view that dog. At the end of the day, any dog is a reactive dog and any dog can display aggression. So there's really no such thing as an aggressive dog and a safe dog. Those things don't exist, not really, because every dog can be everything. And it's very important that we're mindful of really what those labels are doing to us subliminally. And I personally can tell you I struggle with this. I really do, because I do feel that I can easily communicate when I am starting off with a label and I say, today we're talking about aggressive dogs, right? I feel that I can communicate effectively that way, but at the same time, I also struggle because I feel like I'm contributing to a bigger problem, which is how we view these dogs that are experiencing these mental health disorders. And so I'd like to have you tell me in the comments how you feel about those labels. Do you feel that as me saying a reactive dog or an aggressive dog is doing more harm or good? Or do you feel that it's okay with context? I'm very curious because this is something that I personally struggle with. If you enjoyed this video, do me a favor, hit that like button, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell so you get notified when I drop a new video, and I'll see you guys next week.